As the previous video installation had laid out the general conditions and circumstances of the soon-to-erupt battle for Irving, the last major push within the urban area of the DFW Metroplex in order to finally militarily defeat the defenders. In other words, eradicate the final American military forces that were within the city as its defenders, as well as with them being a sizable contingent of armed reactionary civilian forces numbering approximately 1,800, as the original number in the Irving area had been approximately 5,000. Many had perished in the subsequent artillery bombardments, which were excessive and exceedingly destructive, as a combination of 155 millimeter, 152 millimeter, and 300 millimeter rockets, as the artillery shells of the PLL 66 towed howitzers and the PLL 01 towed howitzers were already immensely destructive. The massive strikes from the PHL 03 battalion were simply monumental and left large swathes of the city in absolute total rubbled ruination, as all that remained in many areas were the husks and facades, which were crumbling, of former buildings, as well as gargantuan rubble piles spilling out into the streets, as this enormous display of firepower was unrivaled in the history of war, which pertained to the entire coalition and the sheer amount of ordnance expended upon this nation throughout the invasion thereof. As just within the DFW campaign alone, the PLA forces of the Ready Reserve 59th Group Army were allocated in excess of 1 million shells. That equated to 500,000 152 millimeter shells for the two PLL 66 towed howitzer battalions within the 19th Artillery Brigade of the 59th Group Army, as well as an additional 500,000 155 millimeter shells for the PLL 01 battalions, of which there were two as well. As in addition to these, there were 40,000 shells per maneuver units firing battalions, as in the two PLZ-05 battalions, one in the 16th Infantry Division and one in the 35th Armored Brigade of these very powerful self-propelled howitzers, were allocated 40,000 155 millimeter shells apiece, as well as even the PCL 181 truck mounted self propelled howitzers of the 24th Light Infantry Brigade, who had their own artillery battalion of these systems, also having allotted to them 40,000 shells. As it pertained to the rocket artillery forces, the PHL 03 battalion had allocated to it 30,300 millimeter rockets. The two Type 83 MLRS battalions of also of the 19th Artillery Brigade had allotted to them also 30,000 122 millimeter rockets per battalion. All of this hefty firepower was simply monumental beyond what mere words could articulate, as already in the campaign, 200,000 shells had been expended between the PLL 66 Battalion and PLL 01 Battalion in the northern grouping of firing battalions of the 19th Artillery Brigade, and there had been 10,000 300 millimeter rockets expended just for the push into Irving alone during the 3-hour logistical resupply and maintenance period afforded to the 19th Artillery Brigade's forces. 5,000 additional rockets would be trucked in for use for the PHL 03 Battalion, specifically just for the Irving operation, as well as also there would be an additional 20,000 shells trucked in for the PLL 66 Battalion and PLL 01 Battalion in the Northern Firing Group, each receiving 10,000 shells apiece just for this operation. Again, it has to be understood that upon the CCP regime properties upon which these forces are effectively materialized, they already had enormous stockpiles of the allotted total shells, although they had largely used up most of which that had sat upon these properties, and thus their headquarters and support battalion, which were their command and logistical elements over the entire 19th Artillery Brigade, had to truck in additional shells and rockets for the Northern Firing Group to support the operations occurring in the Irving area, as a major push was set to unfold as the same 3 armored battalions, having had assaulted and taken the international airport, along with, of course, the 2 air assault battalions, which are now occupying and holding down this recent gain, along with the SHORAD battalion moving into the international airport to assist them, having no air targets. The armored forces would be fully in place by 8 a.m. and would begin to conduct their reconnaissance operations utilizing their quadcopter assets to the fullest effect, as already the massive grouping of enemy combatants against the PLA, that is, had been sighted by the high-altitude reconnaissance drones and satellite assets, and, of course, use from quadcopter assets from within the DFW International Airport. However, now, as they pushed in for their envelopment, they could conduct even more thorough mapping in real time of the battle space utilizing their quadcopter assets to the fullest effect. As the defending forces, consisting of the 3rd of the 144th, an American Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the National Guard's 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, were the last remaining viable defending military forces, having had been somewhat protected from the gargantuan artillery strikes by having their Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie companies hidden within the parking garages within which they had been bivouacked, as these forces had been on the lower levels of these multi-floor garages during the bombardment. These massively protected structures, being multi-floor and steel reinforced concrete, effectively protected them from the enormity of the munitions falling upon them, as the top floors were now effectively completely gone and pancaked in. The lower floors still remained and protected the vehicles and troops of these 3 combat companies. However, the other 3 companies of this force, as it were, pertaining to the 3rd of the 144th, were not so fortunate, as they effectively had been more in the open, as it were, pertaining to their bivouac sites, as they had been located in empty lots as well as also city parking lot areas, and thus had lost the vast majority of their vehicles and some of their troops, those which were not fast enough and hadn't scrambled for cover in drainage systems, sewer systems, or also more sturdy buildings or even basement levels of certain structures. As all of these munitions began to fall, even some of the armed reactionary civilians out of the total of 5,000 were relatively quick-witted enough to get themselves to relative safety to effectively wait out this gargantuan barrage, which had finally ceased at 5 a.m. as the artillery forces again had to conduct maintenance and also logistical resupply operations of their own, which took several hours to complete as they were preparing for the next major push, which was set to occur after 8 a.m., as by 8:30, the first major push into the pocket as the envelopment formed by the combination of the two mechanized infantry battalions having had effectively cleared and taken Grand Prairie, as well as the Taylor Army heliport, now moving in to form their part of the cordon in the general south of the pocket, as well as also the armored forces of 3 armored battalions now moving in from the international airport, moving south and effectively hooking around from the east and west as well, as these 3 battalions effectively took the general north part of the east and part of the west portion of the cordon, while the 2 mechanized infantry battalions took the general south, as this entire pocket effectively was a 4-mile north-south by 5.5-mile east-west pocket in total breadth and height, or length and width, as the armored forces of 1 armored battalion would effectively be the first to push into the pocket to begin mopping up operations with heavy support from dedicated Wing Loom 2 combat drones and also loitering munitions strikes from their own loitering munitions, as well as also very heavy air support and returning artillery support, as the 19th Artillery Brigade's forces were effectively replenished and prepared for this next push, as also they had their own fire support elements in the form of their anti-tank company with their AFT-10 ATGM anti-tank vehicles, as these HJ-10 based systems could fire from relatively long ranges, as their maximum range was 6.2 miles, so they could sit relatively far from the main combat operations comfortably and fire from a distance, destroying targets with a high degree of precision, as all of these weapons were ISR and AI guided and directed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as the ISR network and total surveillance apparatus effectively found the targets and their exact coordinates, and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system processed all the targeting data and put together the strike packages for everything from artillery and airstrikes to also missile strikes and artillery strikes, as well as other assets. As all of these forces were now in place by 8 a.m., the first push into the pocket would occur utilizing 2 companies from one of the 3 armored battalions, as 1 tank company and 1 armored infantry company who would effectively leave their combat vehicles behind and move on foot to clear the flanks, which were the massive rubble piles and building husks of the now annihilated city of Irving, as this would become a sort of Battle of Berlin type situation where these forces would fight rubble pile to rubble pile, building husk to building husk, and the combat in this area would be savage and intense as the defending forces, having seen the PLA moving into place from their rubbled positions, would have runners quickly spreading the word that the PLA was on the march and that they were coming for them. As, again, the Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie companies of the 3rd, the 144th, having had survived the massed artillery fire, would emerge from their parking garage bivouac locations and begin to move into place to set up defensive positions against the PLA assault. Although half of the battalion was utterly annihilated in terms of their vehicles and logistical capabilities, as their logistics perished with their vehicles in the massed artillery strikes, as well as many of their troops. The remaining elements of these shattered companies of the battalion would also do their best to take up defensive positions to resist the PLA assault, as they did not want to end up as POWs of the Chinese, as there was a great fear among the American troops, and rightly so, that they could possibly be mistreated in different ways, as the PLA was generally humane to their prisoners of war. They did bend the Geneva Conventions, although they didn't outright break them, but if they were, for example, to be transferred to People's Armed Police custody, all bets were off in terms of their treatment, as it were concerned. The current battle, as it was set to unfold, again, would involve the PLA armor forces moving down the streets in the form of their tank company, which was first to be sent in from one of their 3 battalions, as well as one of 2 armored infantry companies from within their battalion on foot, leaving behind their combat vehicles, which effectively were the same vehicles utilized by the mechanized infantry forces in the form of their ZBDO-4A infantry fighting vehicles, and also their Type 89A APCs, as the troops would be moving on foot as the infantry support for the tank forces, as the armored infantry were built into the armored battalion specifically to support the armor. In this instance, due to the high degree of rubble cascading throughout the city, these forces would need to fight through the rubble piles to ensure that their armor had relatively safe lanes of passage in order to not be hit by Molotov weapons or the very rare anti-armor weapons, including even a small amount having had been captured by some armed reactionary civilians by this point, similar to the Waco and other battles, as tiny PLA patrols in freshly conquered areas were ambushed with varying degrees of success, with some Americans actually making off with small quantities of PLA armaments, including hand grenades and rocket-propelled grenades in the form of the Chinese Type 69s, and even the even more rare HJ-08 ATGM. Although, again, these instances were rare, they were now beginning as the small guerrilla-like bands of more professional partisan-like forces were beginning to start to conduct more intelligent assaults against the now turned occupation forces from invasion forces as they conducted patrols over the freshly conquered areas of the city. As we go to the map of the city, the initial assault that would be carried out by two companies from one of the three participating armored battalions holding the outer cordon, as their flanks were effectively secure, as the ISR capabilities and the general positioning of all the other PLA units throughout the city now at this point in time effectively guaranteed that all that was left in terms of major enemy forces lay in the heart of a metroplex in Irving, and thus the five participating assaulting battalions would not have to worry about their flanks at this time because the ISR capabilities had deemed the area secure. And thus, behind the cordoning forces, the anti-tank companies, one in each armored battalion, could set up miles behind the envelopment and fire into the pocket from safe positions, along with the headquarters and support companies in each battalion sitting back along with the anti-tank companies, leaving each of the battalion's maneuver elements, there are 4 tank companies and 2 armored infantry companies, to hold the cordon and also strike inward from the cordon in the case of the first push into the cordon. As the map of this area effectively is a portion of Irving wherein the gargantuan 300 millimeter barrage, along with the equally massive 152 millimeter and 155 millimeter strikes, had effectively razed this part of the city to the ground and effectively left it looking much like so, as in this particular portion of Irving is a relatively hilly portion of this city, as the Irving area generally has different terrain variations, or elevation variations rather, as the elevation can be relatively steep in some portions of Irving, and thus in this particular part of the city, some of these streets sit on higher ground than do others, as this street generally goes in an upward direction in terms of elevation, while this street follows a ridge line, as does this street here, as Delta Company, one of the 4 combat companies of the 3rd of the 144th, a mechanized infantry company of the National Guard of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, the last remaining defending military unit, had effectively what was a lost platoon, as this company, Delta Company, had left their bivouac site, which in effect was a city parking area, and had raced to the KLX plant, which was effectively one of the main sites in Irving that they were tasked with defending in terms of their entire battalion. And as the invasion had kicked off, some of the battalions comprising companies had not made it to the KLX plant or some of the other sites in Irving they were to defend. And thus, as the communications had been completely brought down, as along with the American ISR capabilities through the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and booting on of electronic warfare assets, the Americans only knew to do what they had been briefed to do, which was to defend the plant. And thus, these forces had tried to make their way to the plant on their own initiative, and were pounded heavily by artillery strikes from the 300 millimeter fires coming in from the PHLO-3 Battalion of the 19th Artillery Brigade of the PLA's 59th Group Army, as well as also the massed shelling from the PLL-66 Battalion of 152 millimeter towed howitzers, and also the PLL-01 Battalion of towed 155 millimeter howitzers, both battalions of howitzers, and the rocket battalion being in the northern grouping of artillery forces of the 19th Artillery Brigade's firing battalions, as they had now been freshly trucked in additional shells and rockets they would be able to fully support this new operation into the Irving area, which was now beginning at 8:30 a.m. after a brief reconnaissance action with the quadcopter assets running circuits through the area, which they would continue to do so as the forces moved slowly from block to block, initially beginning on this far eastern block of this portion of Irving. The dismounted armored infantry forces, would be clearing the flanks, moving from rubble pile to rubble pile, and they would have heavy support from their own anti-tank company firing their potent and very accurate and long-ranged HJ-10 ATGMs, as well as also support from Wing Loom 2 dedicated combat drones and their own CH-901A loitering munition strikes into various targets, as well as also artillery fire, which in this instance would come from the PLL 66 Battalion and the Northern Grouping of 19th Artillery Brigade firing battalions, as well as the PLL 01 Battalion in that same grouping of 155mm howitzers. As well, in addition to this, would be also artillery participating from the 16th Infantry Division's Artillery Battalion of PLZ-05 self-propelled 155mm howitzers, and also the very same battalion of PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers from the 35th Armored Brigade's firing battalion of artillery, as all of this available artillery was immense, and even the rocket artillery would be available, although it would not be used, as these precision operations required precision strikes, which only the howitzer artillery could effectively deliver, as the multiple launch rocket systems of the 300mm variety simply covered too large of an area, and as these armored forces were gradually pushing through and mopping up enemy resistance, the howitzers were more highly desired due to their more precise effects, although they were still highly destructive when fired in concentrated form. The air power would also be supporting the efforts in this operation, although the fighter aircraft, now having had returned an hour prior at 7:30 a.m. after conducting their RTB to effectively prepare for their next operations, as they would now effectively be rearmed with mostly air-to-ground munitions, as their air-to-air munitions would effectively be more limited in exchange for air-to-ground munitions, as effectively the entire USAF and US Naval and US Marine Corps aviation was completely annihilated, most of which on the ground, but there were still a relatively sizable amount of aircraft that were airborne at the time that were also destroyed in the air, as these aircraft, including the JH-7 strike aircraft, which carried a whopping nearly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, had returned to conduct strike missions and close air support missions. They would be constantly supported by the wide array of coalition refueling aircraft in the form of rotating YY-20 or YU-20 refueling aircraft, as well as also the Russian IL-78 refueling aircraft, as well as even Chinese H-6 refueling aircraft, which were the refueler version of the strategic bomber aircraft, which carried, of course, much less fuel than did the YU-20, which was the third largest refueling aircraft in the world in terms of fuel capacity. Although these different refueling aircraft rotated throughout the North Texas and Southern Oklahoma area in order to keep all of the coalition aircraft airborne for very extended amounts of time. The heavy strategic bomber aircraft, having had jettisoned all of their payloads and having left the area just after 2 a.m., would be arriving around 9 a.m. after the ground crews responsible for getting these aircraft mission ready will have worked like race car pit crews in record time, and having these strategic bombers back in the air and en route after a 4-hour span of time on the ground, as the flight time between their forward bases and the battle space was effectively only 1 hour and a half. They would return right on time to participate in the Irving operation, could be used in a more tactical role where they could carpet munition enemy forces instead of just focusing on strategic targets alone, as these aircraft carried gargantuan payloads. They could level huge portions of cities below, as is demonstrated in this animation or illustration, as the massive H-6K carried 34,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions. The even heavier stealth H-20 strategic bomber aircraft carried 90,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, and these aircraft would wreak havoc in the Irving operations, as there were only 3 fully functional remaining combat companies within the American Mechanized Infantry Battalion remaining, the 3rd of the 144th. These forces were now leaving their parking garages, or what was left of them, to begin to emerge to prepare to engage the oncoming PLA forces as they now moved into defensive positions throughout different portions of Irving, as the remains of their other 3 shattered companies, which was their headquarters company, effectively, headquarters of headquarters company, as well as also the Delta Company, which was another combat company, mechanized infantry, and the Foxtrot Company, which, of course, came from the now defunct 949th Brigade Support Battalion, were all moving into positions in the rubble to assist, along with the armed reactionary civilians, in defending this portion of the city. Again, not wanting to become prisoners of war, many opted to go down swinging, as the saying went, as the PLA forces pushed into this portion of Irving, as the first strike into the area came from the east. As we go to the map, the lost platoon, or the first platoon of Delta Company, had effectively had all of their vehicles annihilated in the mass 300mm rocket strikes, along with the concentration of 152 and 155mm howitzer strikes, as all of these shells and rockets saturated this portion of the city. Their vehicles became caught up in the annihilation and effectively were now smoking, ripped up, burned out hulks of metal, with half of the platoon being outright annihilated, not having scrambled for cover just fast enough as the invasion had kicked off and they were en route to the KLX plant, which was just west of this location, as these forces were pushing towards that direction, as the PLA forces intended on mopping up all enemy resistance in this pocket, as well as also containing and then either capturing or wiping out the leadership of the remaining 3rd of the 144th, the last viable defending American military unit, as finishing this unit off would result in a military defeat for the Americans in the DFW area, as their last military forces will have been completely removed from the literal and proverbial map, leaving only scattered bands of armed reactionary civilians, both sizable and small, to take up arms and fight back against the invasion turned occupation forces, as this node was now being completely brought under PLA control. The external invasion forces, according to fourth-generation warfare doctrines, would easily be able to move through this node seamlessly without having to get off to engage enemy forces to be able to continue deep inland, where they would shed off group armies and then spread out what remained to reinforce the Trojans deeper inland, according to the doctrines. While en route through this node, the 59th Support Brigade would be able to operate their supply stations and replenish the external forces needing fuel and potential armaments or even maintenance assistance as they move through the area, as these many miles long convoys of external invasion forces moving up the highways would effectively, from beginning to the very end of these miles long convoys, take hours to move through the area. And again, many would be stopping off to top off their supplies, as they would require fuel and some armaments, food and maintenance, and even some medical attention if need be. As in this instance, the Wing-Loong 2 dedicated combat drones that were providing direct support in this area to the two companies from one of the three armored battalions on the cordon, the tank company in its 4 combat platoons, leaving its headquarters platoon behind, along with the combat vehicles with their drivers and gunners, and also their higher NCOs and officers, such as their company captain, with their combat vehicles and headquarters platoon vehicles of the mechanized, or the armored infantry company rather, sending out the armored infantry troops on foot to clear the flanks in support of the armored thrust into the area, as the tanks would be moving directly down the streets on their push to mop up this entire area of all the armed reactionary civilians contained therein, as well as also any military personnel, such as the 2 squad-sized elements that remained of the lost platoon, or the first platoon that had effectively been lost in the artillery barrage and mostly annihilated, minus 2 squads worth from this entire platoon that had survived by taking cover and then emerging and making contact with each other and effectively moving into place to take up positions, as the armed reactionary civilians running through the area, having sighted the PLA, were spreading word quickly through the area that there were PLA forces near and that they were advancing on the area. As these Wing-Loong 2s had come in, they had fired their very powerful CM502KG dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank missiles at enemy personnel in these rubbled positions in terms of the armed reactionary civilian elements, as also artillery strikes were called in through the use of quadcopter assets as these personnel had been sighted moving. So as the artillery had come in, it had smashed these personnel along with the CM502KGs, just as what occurred here in the south, as the same occurrence happened, as personnel had been sighted moving into these smashed apartment complex buildings. CM502KGs were fired into the rubble piles that used to be multi-floor apartments, and artillery strikes called in as well, completely annihilating this entire rubble pile full of armed reactionary civilian elements. As that was occurring, these dismounted armored infantry troops moving through the area were effectively now beginning to clear the flanks, as in the north, these 2 squads from this northernmost platoon of dismounted armored infantry troops, having left their combat vehicles behind to move on foot to support the armor, were moving through these 2 blocks to clear the area of armed reactionary civilians, laying down heavy fire as contact was made with armed reactionary civilians in this rubble pile, as this line formation would break for the rubble and effectively get into a line position and lay down heavy fire on these forces, while this line formation came around to outflank them and L-vector fire into these forces, while the tanks would be very careful with their fire not to harm their own troops that had now taken position to L-vector fire and fight over the rubble pile itself, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the quadcopter ISR capabilities could get the exact coordinates on these personnel and even advise the vehicle crews what types of munitions to use and the angle and traverse of their weapons in order to effectively safeguard the safety of their troops to prevent friendly fire incidences, as they were laying down heavy small arms, rocket-propelled grenade fire, even HJ-08 fire, 35 millimeter tube-fired grenade fire from beneath the barrels of the troops and squads that carried those, and more light machine gun fire as well, as these troops were doing the same thing. This tank, as these tanks are moving relatively slow, could support their troops by firing frag T shells into this rubble pile whenever and wherever possible if they could get a good bead on the enemy in terms of being able to actually hit them in a way through the rubble to where it would actually cause KIAs and eliminate them, as the rubble provided, again, excellent fighting positions for the defending forces, although, again, each and every rubble pile would be contested by the armored infantry troops supporting their tanks through the city. Again, soldiers firing a 35 millimeter grenade from behind the safety of their tank here. They're firing from around their tank, soldiers in the prone, laying down fire, burning vehicles in the streets, rubble husks that there's personnel taking cover in, firing back behind rubble piles, cascading into the streets. Armored infantry troops taking cover in the rubble, firing in Type 69 RPG, laying down rifle fire, tank gun fire, 125 millimeter shells. There's the turret machine gun, coax machine guns laying down fire as well, 7.62 by 54 millimeter, artillery explosions in the background, as of course the artillery again was supporting this operation to the hilt, along with the returned air power in the form of the J-11 squadron, now heavily laden down with air-to-ground munitions, including the J-10 fighter squadron as well as the J-11 squadron. And of course, there was the ground attack squadron of JH-7s allocated to this particular battle space. Again, they carried the heaviest amount of ordnance in terms of the strike capacity of the three different aircraft types, as this was a dedicated strike aircraft, whereas these were fighter aircraft that could be used in a strike capacity, as they were capable of carrying air-to-ground munitions, although their primary role was air-to-air combat. But now, as there was effectively no real air targets remaining, as again, USAF, US Navy, and US Marine Corps aviation was completely eradicated, these forces could focus completely on air-to-ground operations, as they had already, again, done their RTB and returned first, as these smaller aircraft are much easier to prepare for missions than were the much larger and heavier strategic bombers, although these aircraft would be returning soon, as again, these aircraft were the first to leave the battle space to give them a good lead time to prepare for their next operations. Everything was highly coordinated, and timing was everything in this operation through this doctrine of fourth generation warfare. Again, everything was to be rapid and done in a highly synchronized, highly coordinated manner, as the forces fighting through the rubble piles, through the streets, were now engaging a sizable grouping of armed reactionary civilians. As again, there was 650 in this particular zone, along with two remaining squad-sized elements of American troops, as their vehicles had been completely annihilated and left the smoking, burning, shredded up hulks of metal in the streets. These forces were to take cover in the rubble and try to put up the best resistance they could from these positions in this former mixed residential and commercial area, as there were large shopping centers with former big box stores and grocery stores and more in these areas that had now been completely laid to total ruination. There were smaller businesses, there were apartments, and there were homes even in some of these areas. But this area, now completely flattened from recurring massed artillery bombardments, effectively left nothing left other than complete total rubble piles, which would be fought over and highly contested, as the armored infantry forces and the American troops would engage one another over these piles as the armor progressed down the streets. As this northern platoon was moving through the area alongside of their slower moving tanks in order to keep pace with them, they were laying down heavy interlocking fields of fire against armed reactionary civilian forces, as the tanks were also laying down heavy fire into this particular rubble pile, former business here, as the fire was heavy into this rubble pile from the main battle tanks, firing heat shells, high explosive shells, and frag T shells into this rubble pile, along with the heavy interlocking fields of fire coming from these two squads, while this squad maneuvered its way around to engage them from behind, fighting them over this rubble pile, L-vectored fire. While the tanks, again, were also coordinating their fires with these squads through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, getting the proper angle and traverse of weapons and the right ammunition types to use. All of this highly coordinated firepower simply overwhelmed the armed reactionary civilians in this rubble pile, and the rubble pile would be taken, and the squads would advance till they reached the end of the street with their armor. As this fighting here was relatively heavy, there would be wounded PLA troops from these two squads. And as the PLA aviation forces from within the air assault battalions, effectively at this point, were no longer busy transporting troops, they would now be utilized in medevac and even logistical resupply operations, as the air assault forces by this time were largely holding their gains in terms of the territory that they had conquered throughout the city. This effectively meant the downtowns of both Dallas and Fort Worth, as well as also the international airport, the DFW International Airport. As again, there had been two other battalions that had even left the entire battle space to effectively capture the city of Weatherford, which was an outlying city of the Metroplex beyond the general boundaries of the Metroplex to the west. The air assault battalions holding that area would continue to hold that area throughout the course of the invasion, while the remaining 6 battalions within the 83rd Air Assault Brigade would remain in the Metroplex, which included the headquarters and the maintenance battalions, along with the 4 air assault battalions that had taken the DFW International Airport and the 2 downtown areas of Fort Worth and Dallas. As the transport aviation companies in each of these 4 battalions, again, were effectively no longer busy transporting air assault troops into battle, they could be marshaled to assist in medevac operations and, again, logistical resupply operations as it pertained to the battle occurring for Irving at this time. As the Z-20 utility helicopters would be utilized to fly in to pick up the wounded PLA troops from these 2 squads, as there were several, and they would be medevaced out of the battle space quickly as these 2 squads moved into place to pull security and effectively allow for the medevac to occur, while the tanks, having had moved into place and fired into this rubble pile, had utilized their quadcopter assets to call in precision artillery strikes, which simply annihilated this massive grouping as well, moving into this rubble pile, as they were easily seen by the quadcopter assets moving, as well as also the personnel beginning to effectively pop up out of the rubble and fire at the main battle tanks now at the street corner, who were firing back at them. Loitering munition strikes came in, along with 155 millimeter strikes from both the PLZ-05 battalion and its comprising firing batteries within the 35th Armored Brigade, as well as also the PLL-01 battalion and the northern grouping of firing battalions of the 19th Artillery Brigade, as the 152 millimeter Battalion in the northern grouping of the PLL 66 howitzers were likewise very busy at this time. They had also assisted in shelling this former apartment complex with all of the movement that was spotted by the Wingling 2 and the other quadcopter assets running circuits through the area. Anything that moved having its coordinates effectively taken in order for strikes to ensue, as had occurred up here as well, as other strikes would effectively initiate as more and more forces were discovered by the oncoming PLA armored forces moving into the area, as these forces were at the corner. At the same time as that was occurring, this platoon of Type 96B main battle tanks was also rolling down the street in their particular sector of the operation, as they, on their flanks being cleared, were also another platoon, both on their right flank and on their left flank as they moved into the area. As this tank platoon moved into the area, the northern platoon's 3 southernmost squads had cleared this area along with the tank fire, and to the south of this column and to the north of this column, these 2 platoons of tanks, these 3 squads from this platoon, as these 2 squads were part of this same platoon in the center platoon, were moving through this area, assaulting rubble piles, as there were no enemy personnel apart from these personnel in this rubble pile. They had annihilated them before then in an L-vector fire, before then moving on to seize this corner here as these tanks moved up. At the same time, these 2 squads were bounding and covering tactically into this massive rubble pile of a former shopping center with big box stores and grocery stores, and were now beginning to assault with this platoon in the south, the southernmost platoon of the 3 platoons, south, center, and north. These forces from these platoons were cooperating in this effort, as this center platoon here, the 3 squads here and the 2 squads here, were cooperating with the southernmost platoon, with these 2 squads effectively assaulting this rubble pile, which was again a former massive shopping center. While this squad moved into place, they were taking fire but returning fire with their small arms and RPGs, 35mm grenade fire, HJO8 fire, and there were loitering munition strikes coming in. All of it ISR and real-time AI battlefield data processing system directed. And as this squad bounded and covered against these forces here, tank fire came into this rubble pile from this column as they were moving down the street, just as they supported operations on either side, as these tanks had staggered weapons to watch all fields of fire of their column, even behind them, as the supporting infantry on either side of the armored infantry were clearing the flanks with support from the tanks, while the infantry supported the tanks mutually, as the tanks supported them with fire from their 125mm main guns, 7.62 by 54 coax, and even turret 12.7mm heavy machine guns from the turret gunners, like so, as the 12.7mm was a very powerful anti-materiel heavy machine gun and could shred through all manner of building materials with a concentration of fire, especially into the same spot. It would eventually rip through bricks and even certain layers of concrete and other building materials. As these troops took positions in the rubble, they fought over the rubble pile against these armed reactionary civilians, as these 2 squads in wedge formation and a double column formation, which became a wedge formation, annihilated these personnel with tank support before this squad effectively peeled off to push south and have L-vectored tactical vectoring of fire with loitering munition strikes with this double column formation, which would become a line formation, laying down fire with this wedge formation becoming a line formation, laying down fire, L-vectored tactical fires, before they bounded into the rubble pile straight through this area, as down in here, this grouping had left this massive rubble pile as this fighting was going on, and now we're moving through this area as the squad, originally having laid down fire in assistance with these squads here, laying down L-vector fire, concentrated fire directly ahead, along with this line formation moving along this rubble building before turning into a wedge formation and laying down heavy fire as they bounded into this area, with this squad laying down L-vectored fire, destroying this grouping here, L-vectored fire, before both then moving and taking position at the end of this pile, just as this squad moved to this position at the end of the pile along the street, as did this squad move and all get in line formations, including the squad up here in the north of this section. As they all got in a large line formation, they laid down heavy fire across the street on these forces here, who then, the remains, retreated, with quadcopter assets getting the bead of all of these personnel in this pile, as much movement had been spotted by the time all of this movement had occurred to the end of this block with all of these forces. As this tank platoon in the south was moving to the end of the block, these two squads of the southernmost platoon were moving straight ahead along this rubble pile and engaged these personnel. At the same time these battles were occurring up here, engaged these personnel with interlocking fields of fire and tank support from tank shell fire before destroying them and crossing this parking lot and taking position at the end in a line formation, just as these troops did, and as these troops did all along this city block. As now heavy artillery fire began to come down into this area as these line formations were laying down heavy fire into this rubble pile that, again, was a massive shopping center. And these former shops here were being heavily bombarded as movement was spotted here, as tank shells were vectored into these forces, causing the rest to try to retreat deeper into the rubble, only to be heavily shelled, as the massive shelling had now begun to come in onto this rubble pile. The artillery coming from the 152 millimeter PLL-66 howitzers, 155 millimeter PLL-01 howitzers, and of course even the PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers from the 35th Armored Brigade's Artillery Battalion. The Artillery Battalion of the 16th ID was not firing in this first initial operation. However, they would be joining as the mechanized infantry battalions in the south, whom they would be supporting directly, would be the next forces to effectively move in, along with more armored forces moving south from their positions in the north of the pocket, roughly the same time, as the mechanized infantry would begin their assault at the same time as other armored forces in the north would begin their assault into the area. The heavy strategic bomber aircraft would be returning at about that time, as at 9 a.m., the mechanized infantry push and the other armored push in the far north of the pocket would begin after this initial push at 8:30 from the east moving westwards, as gradually the PLA forces would be closing in on the remaining American defenders. Each and every push would clear more and more ground throughout the pocket and eradicate the defending forces, as also at this time, the battalion's anti-tank company was now fully set up and capable of firing their HJ-10 ATGMs, as these forces now made it to the end of the first block. And as the heavy artillery bombardments came into this area and saturated it with 152 millimeter and 155 millimeter howitzer shells, all of these forces were being annihilated as they tried desperately to retreat deeper into the rubble, only to be eradicated by all of this heavy firepower, as all of these forces had already been destroyed by loitering munition strikes and artillery strikes earlier, as these forces reached the end at the same time as this had begun to occur. These forces, having no enemies on this particular block, all three squads from the center platoon, would now bound together across this rubble pile and temporarily stop in this position as the armor would begin moving forward. As these forces had been destroyed, these forces being engaged by this squad and these other two squads in these rubble piles, laying down heavy fire with these forces moving into the area, only to be destroyed by tank shell fire and concentrated interlocking fields of fire from these three squads would destroy these forces and these forces as well as they moved into the area, along with tank shell fire vectored into these rubble piles here, destroying these forces with heat shells, frag T shells, HE shells, and the large concentration of dismounted infantry fire from the armored infantry, and now also HJ-10 ATGM fires, which again were highly accurate and very destructive weapons, and because these were arc-fired weapons, they could come crashing down the top of the defending forces' heads, so to speak, as all these forces were simply annihilated by the artillery. The tanks would continue forward in the south, as these forces, having destroyed these two squads, having had destroyed these enemy personnel along with tank shell fire, having had taken positions along this rubble, would bound across the street into this rubble pile, only for this squad to peel north and lay down heavy fire onto these forces, as the tanks would also lay down heavy shell fire before advancing after destroying these forces, with these squads in these positions having laid down fire, leading to the artillery strikes earlier. Again, as this was occurring at the same time as these squads got into position, these squads did as well, and the artillery came in as these forces retreated, taking fire from these squads here, the tanks, and these personnel in these line formations. This squad would now move south along with this other squad, leaving the map, as the armor would also move with them, as this area had been completely eradicated. To their north, on the next street up, the armor would continue alongside of these three squads moving down along this rubble pile in this parking area, which were former shops along this ridge line, which the next street up effectively sat upon. These squads were now moving through all of this rubble, taking up position at the end of the rubble pile. All five of these squads from the center platoon and southern platoon here, as there were three squads from the southern platoon, with the other two moving off map, and two squads from the northern platoon taking up position along this now totally shelled to complete and total cratered ruins of rubble pile, as it was already heavily destroyed, with more rubble being thrown around from place to place by the additional artillery strikes, which were all precision strikes guided by the quadcopter ISR assets through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, leading to the absolute decimation of these forces that had taken up position here. They now could effectively take up line formation positions along this rubble pile, using the rubble as cover, and lay down fire into these forces who now were coming up out of the rubble and trying to engage them, including right here as well in this former apartment office, trying to engage these forces, with loitering munition strikes coming into this area from loitering munitions as these forces laid down heavy fire. As the tanks would now roll into position, they could fire down into this rubble pile, practically landing tank shells on top of the heads of these individuals, including firing down into this pile as well. The personnel on this pile had already been destroyed by the dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missiles and artillery strikes that hit this area heavily while these forces were advancing through this area. As the same thing had occurred up here, these forces also being destroyed by shells and loitering munitions and fire coming in from the tanks. These forces now moving through this area, including these two squads, having been in a line formation, now getting into wedge formations and bounding tactically across the street, having had eradicated these forces earlier, taking a position along the rubble and in the rubble, now encountering the two surviving squad-sized forces of American troops in these rubble piles, now trying to fire all they had, which were their small arms, their M249 SAWs, or squad automatic weapons, which were 5.56 caliber light machine guns, the riflemen firing their M16 A2s, as these were again non-combat troops. I mean, again, these were combat troops, but these were National Guardsmen, so they had older M16s, and also their 40 millimeter grenades from beneath some of the M16s. The troops had those, and some AT4 fire that was being fired at these PLA troops. PLA would lose some troops in this instance, as these were professional combat troops and could actually fight relatively well against these PLA forces, although the PLA had interlocking fields of fire, and they too had heavier weapons in the form of ATGMs. They had rocket-propelled grenades, which effectively was their light anti-armor weapon / anti-personnel weapon, as they had anti-personnel rounds, which were fragmentation rockets, and they had 35 millimeter grenades to fire back at the American forces, as they had interlocking fields of fire. As the tanks moved up, these squads laid down heavy fire into the American forces, with tank shells now being vectored into them as well, as the tanks were also firing at this pile, causing these surviving Americans to retreat, only to be hit by precision artillery strikes as they retreated, as these forces were destroyed by tank shells and heavy fire coming in from these two squads that had advanced onto this rubble pile, which had already been destroyed earlier by artillery and loitering munition strikes. And now HJ-10 fire was also coming in as well and hitting these forces, in addition to tank shells and also the small arms and light anti-armor / anti-personnel weapons and more. These Americans would finally be eradicated, and these three survivors that tried to retreat deeper into the rubble pile were pinpointed with their coordinates and hit with precision artillery strikes from 152 millimeter shell fire and 155 fire from a PLZ-05 battery from the PLZ-05 battalion within the 35th Armored Brigade. These forces were hit heavily as they tried to retreat with artillery. These forces already destroyed by tank fire, HJ-08 fire, and the squads laying down heavy fire. These two squads here and this squad here. These two squads would then occupy their positions here, while this squad would proceed along the rubble pile. Again, this was a former shop area with shops along this street, these two streets, with a parking area on either side. They now advanced and took position in the rubble and along the rubble, and got in line formations and began to lay down fire on these forces, who tried to fire back at them, but then the tanks moving up fired shells into them as well. There's again mutual support between the main battle tanks and the dismounted infantry troops, who were backed to the hilt by their anti-tank forces as well, which offered them hefty fire support in the face of their bounding advances, as they bounded and covered tactically from rubble pile to rubble pile, building husk to building husk. Again, it's like a Battle of Berlin type situation between these forces, as they, again, fought very savage battles between each other, as these pitched battles were for control over Irving, as this area had to be fully cleared of defending forces by the PLA armor and mechanized infantry troops, again with enormous artillery support, combat drone support in the form of the Wing-Loom 2s, and of course loitering munition support, as the destroyed American vehicles littered the street in this particular area, the tanks would proceed right past them as these forces continued to bound through the rubble piles. As this grouping had moved through this area, as artillery had struck and destroyed these forces as they had been spotted moving by the quadcopters running circuits and mapping the area in real time, these forces would be destroyed by artillery strikes. As small arms fire was being laid down, artillery would come in and destroy these forces, and these forces as well, they were already destroyed as fire would be laid down between the tanks. The troops, after having defeated the American military personnel taking position here, having evacuated their KIAs, they would lay down heavy fire into these personnel from their positions, with artillery strikes coming in and finishing them off, while this grouping would then move in and take position in the rubble as these troops were preparing to bound into place, although they would lay down heavy fire with tank shell support, destroying these forces with also ATGM fires coming in heavily from the AFT-10 anti-tank company, firing their HJ-10 long-range potent ATGMs. And they could fire a large quantity of them between the 20 vehicles of their company, each having 8 pods for these missiles, as these forces would be eradicated by artillery and these forces moving through by HJ-10 fire and small arms fire, rocket fire from Type 69s, RPGs, and HJ-10 strikes, besides the tank shell fire as well. These forces would be also eradicated before these squads would then continue moving to the end of this block, just as these squads, having finished off the American military personnel and these personnel with heavy artillery strikes as they laid down heavy fire and their quadcopter assets got the precise coordinates for the strikes, would then also move into position at the end of this block in their line formations, as the tanks would then be moving up alongside of them as they cleared the flanks on their advance. As in this area, as these forces had moved through this area, they too would be wiped out by tank shell fire and HJ-10 strikes and loitering munition strikes as these forces moved along this ridge line in this parking area trying to get across the street. They were out in the open and highly vulnerable to these strikes and were completely destroyed, again, by loitering munitions, HJ-10s, tank shell fire, and even small arms fire from these advancing 3 squads. As these 3 squads were effectively following one behind the other, they would now bound and take position in this rubble pile at the end of this block, as the tanks would then move down this street. As these personnel fled as soon as this assault had occurred, upon getting atop this ridge line, they would be struck by ATGM strikes from HJ-10s, as well as tank shell fire being fired at them as they had clear shots at these personnel. As these personnel would be destroyed in the final bounds of these 3 squads moving into position here after having destroyed these forces, and then this squad moving up along this rubble pile. These forces long since been gone as this happened as they were moving up the first block. They now moved into place and laid down heavy fire on the personnel remaining in this rubble pile as they now began to emerge to try to fight back against these PLA forces, laying down L-vectored tactical fire into these personnel. As this squad here was laying down fire from this position, while this squad had moved up to lay down fire from this position, and these squads here laid down fire from this position, HJ-10 strikes came in, and then they were able to bound and seize this rubble pile while they would hold their positions in these rubble piles, and again the tanks would roll forward as the tank platoon here in the center would roll past the destroyed American vehicles in the form of their IFVs and APCs of their platoon, much like so, all in a line, although they were more ripped up than even in this image what it conveys, as the artillery strikes were savage and ripped these vehicles to complete and total shreds. the tank platoon would roll right past them to their end point, as this 1.5 mile by 1 mile area would be fully cleared of enemy personnel, as the vast majority of them would be simply wiped out by the gargantuan size of the artillery fires. As again, there were 650 armed reactionary civilians in just this area alone out of the approximately 1,800 that were left, as there were literally several hundred of them between these two shopping centers alone. As this is what, difficult to see, but this is what 300 personnel effectively looks like. They were all eradicated, with the other 300 distributed throughout this area, being gradually mopped up, along with the two surviving combat squads, or squad-sized elements, as it was a combination from these different squads from this platoon, the survivors of these different squads mingling together and effectively putting up resistance, only to be mopped up with the rest of the defending armed reactionary civilians as the armor rolled on. As the tanks rolled forward, they would all reach their next objectives, even the tank platoon off map rolling to the south of this apartment complex, including with these two southernmost squads from the southernmost platoon. They, too, were clearing the flanks just south and off this map. As again, this area contained a relatively sizable number of the remaining cluster, as it could be called, of armed reactionary civilians defending this portion of the city, along with the first platoon of Delta Company, which, what was left of it, was completely and totally eradicated by artillery strikes, ATGM strikes, and well-concentrated tank fire and small arms fire from these squads, as well as also even the large number of loitering munitions in this area, and also the use of the Wingloom 2 dedicated combat drones. All of this different type of firepower was working exceedingly well hand in hand, and with the high concentration and high degree of accuracy and precision in targeting throughout this horribly gutted, rubbled, ruined area, effectively mopped up any and all remaining armed reactionary civilian elements, along with any American military elements that were effectively hiding in this area. Thus, they were completely and totally destroyed, as the battle for Irving was only getting started, as there were still more American military personnel to be dealt with in other parts of Irving in this city, as the other armored battalions, as in the other two holding the rest of the cordon, even the rest of the same armored battalion from which these two companies partook, holding their portion of the cordon, would be sending in more of their companies to effectively mop up the remaining resistance. The Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie companies especially were still major threats and had to be dealt with. And the armored battalions holding the north and the western portions of the envelopment would likewise be committing forces to this action, although the northernmost of the three armored battalions would be the next battalion to commit forces to this operation, and they would have very powerful air support while so doing, namely in the form of a single H-20 heavy stealth strategic bomber aircraft, although again, The fighter aircraft, such as the J-10 Squadron and the J-11 Squadron, were now armed with air-to-ground munitions, as well as also the dedicated strike aircraft, and all of which were able to perform strike and close air support operations. The mechanized infantry battalions, of which there were 2 committed from the 16th Infantry Division, would also be conducting their operations at the same time as the armored battalion in the northern part of the cordon would also be committing forces. As after this massive operation was set to conclude in Irving, although there would be small flare-ups, considering how large the battle had been up to this point, with armed reactionary civilians inside the city remaining on the first day, there would be a lull in the fighting towards the end of the first day, with very minor skirmishes here and there, with very tiny bands of armed reactionary civilians willing to try to conduct guerrilla-like assaults against the invaders turned occupiers. But the lull would effectively only last for a short time, as major operations would be planned for the second day, wherein the air assault forces would prepare a major attack against a large grouping of armed civilians, which included armed civilian militia-type forces now hiding out in the national grasslands, having had fled there on day 1, as the PLA forces of their air assault battalions would commit their forces to this assault against the armed civilians hiding in the national grasslands. And they, too, would have massive air and artillery and even missile support from strategic missile forces. This would be a battle of pure annihilation to completely and totally crush any conceivable possibility of an armed civilian uprising or partisan uprising, so to speak, or insurgency against the colonization efforts of the Chinese, as the CCP regime would have their colony called New China, and they would not tolerate any form of resistance whatsoever at all, and would be prepared to crush it before it would even have a chance to effectively arise. Therefore, they would hunt down, using their quasi-elite air assault forces, the cluster of armed civilians having had fled into this wilderness area in the outer periphery of the massive metropolis that was the DFW Metroplex. More to come in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines utilizing a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, utilizing real-world everything. More to come in the next video.